And who remembers where we are? Anybody?
We were going to talk a little bit about Amba.
Oh yes, Amba. Okay, Amba is backstory. We've got some backstory with Amba. What else has happened? Oh, Carol. What has just happened is the Rakshasa has been killed in Ekachakra. Their cover is probably blown, and they're feeling restless. They've been hiding now as Brahmins for a long time, and these are great Kshatriya warriors, and they're a little discontented. And the story is, of course, about what? It's about the battle between the part of us that is wedded to this world, loves the thought of happiness in this world, that we're just going to get ours and everything's going to work out, and the part of us that knows better and knows where happiness really comes from and is interested in expanding back into oneness with Spirit. So, yes?
What's the symbolism of the omnibus being hiding? Is it just that we need to develop
Certainly that. Did everybody hear that? Is it about do we need to develop our spiritual power? Certainly. But what happens is when we're born, when we're created, of course, spirituality, just how we're made anatomically, spirituality is foremost. It starts at the ego, and then the brain develops and the spine develops, and of course Yudhishthira and Bhima. But as Bhima is born, of course the downside is Duryodhana. They're born on the same day, they've got the same power, but one is worldly and pointed downward, one is vitality and freedom and pointed upward. And then you've got, of course, Arjuna, and then you've got Nakula and Sahadev. But remember back before the path, which is a little hard for you. But remember back before the path. You knew there was something else trying to happen. You knew there was something else that was possible. There was a prior and more valid claim to the kingdom of your consciousness. But you were just having a nice time. You were in college. You remember the good times and the messing around and the fun and before college and just all the enthusiasms of youth and how wonderful it is. And it's all just going to work out, even though you kind of remember there's something else. And then all of a sudden something changes and spirituality emerges. And so that's, they come out of Pandu dies, wisdom dies, the clear discriminating, but the sons of Pandu are still alive. And so they come out of the woods and they return to the kingdom. It's the first glimmerings of spirituality. We discover it, right? And it's wonderful, and it's glorious, and it's beautiful, and it's powerful, but we don't quite know what to do with it. And we start to struggle with our spirituality. We start to struggle with the fact that here it is, and it's got its own realities, and it wants to have its own agenda, and it's beginning to introduce kirtan, it's beginning to introduce prayer, and we're beginning to look around. And finally we just go, to hell with it, I'm just going to go back to partying, right? And we burn it out, we try and burn it, we get rid of it. And the desire for freedom, the desire for things of this world are fighting. And that's Bhima and Duryodhana having their battles. And so spirituality just kind of disappears. The first thing that happens, of course, is Duryodhana and Bhima. Hey, Ken, how are you? Duryodhana and Bhima get into the battle so much that Duryodhana decides to destroy him. And so vitality, the attachment, I'm just going to do the world really, really well, and the heck with it. And so Bhima disappears for how long? 8 days. But he's not gone, he's not dead, even though you feel like he's gone. I've finally gotten rid of spirituality, just heck with it. He comes back and he's now not only as big as he was, but he's as strong as 8,000 elephants. That vitality roars back in time and time again. Again, spirituality is trying to make it always work, but material desire cannot abide spirituality. So it's always trying to destroy it, will not share the kingdom. So again, spirituality got driven into hiding, got burned out of the kingdom, and everybody thought it was dead. Everybody's rejoicing. The blind mind thinks, finally, material attachment. Old Shakuni, he's rejoicing. He's really glad they got rid of it. And material desire and anger, all those things. We got the kingdom back. It's finally happened. And of course, they're off there killing demons every so often, and and hiding and just biding the time. And then course, something happens and spirituality knows it's going to be discovered that is in there brooding. It's been kind of just maturing, ripening. So, where we are in the story is, of course, thank you. Thank you for doing that, yeah. Where we are in the I asked him to go back and get something. I forgot. Hello, Melissa. Welcome. So, where we are in the story now is the five brothers have been in a town that was haunted by a Rakshasa. And they've been going around begging and living as Brahmins. But Bhima went and killed Baka, the Rakshasa, and liberated the town, but now everybody's wondering who did it. And rumor's going to get out, and they know they're restless now. Everybody, they're concerned that everybody's going to find out that something happened. It's going to get pinned on them. They're going to discover that they're still alive, and they're extremely vulnerable because they have no kingdom. It's just five brothers, and Duryodhana has been wooing the kingdom, and so they're very vulnerable. So they're a little unsettled. They don't know. And about this time, in Dekachakra, comes a messenger from the king Drupada. Now, I want to pause there. Can you hold that place? Can you hold that picture? Because Drupada actually is a major character in this dance all the way through. Now, we remember what happened with Drona and Drupada, right? And the antagonism that was there, even though they had been boyhood friends, boon companions, and the snubbing as an adult by Drupada of Drona and Drona's revenge and the splitting of the kingdom, but now Drupada wants revenge, and so he has two children who are fire-born. One is Drishtadyumna. He is the calm inner light, and he's born of extreme dispassion. Isn't that a great metaphor? And then, of course, Drupadi. So he's born to kill Drona, and then Drupadi, the most beautiful woman ever, is born of the same fire. They step out together, and she is born to woo and wed Arjuna, and thus bind Arjuna to the house of Drupada. Well, we left somebody way long time ago in the story just hanging by a thread. And that was way back when Vichitravirya was the heir to the household of Hastinapura. It was Chitrangada and Vichitravirya, way back, sons of Santanu. And everything was going to work out, except that he didn't have any heirs. Chitrangada has been killed, and Vichitravirya is now the Yuvaraj. And so Bhishma, remember, went off to the Swayamvara, and he captures the three women to bring home as wives for Vichitravirya. And it was Amba, Ambika, and Ambalika. And Ambika and Ambalika were really thrilled with it, but Amba wasn't. She had been putting her garland around the neck of the king of Salva. And because Bhishma took her, she is now spurned by the king of Salva. He won't have anything to do with her. He will not receive a gift from his enemy, his sworn enemy now, which is Bhishma, because Bhishma has humiliated him. Bhishma has interrupted his plans, and he's a kshatriya, and he's arrogant, and he's full of himself, so he will have nothing to do with her. So she goes back to Bhishma, and she says, he won't have me. And Vichitravirya says, I would marry you, but you've given your heart to somebody else. How can I marry you? It would be adharmic. And she looks at Bhishma and she says, you have to marry me. And he says, I feel really bad about this. Why didn't you tell me? And she says, well, it was a lot of energy going on. I was scared, and I just, and so anyway, she says, you have ruined my life. You have to marry me. And he said, I would, but I've taken this terrible vow. Remember the vow he took? I will never have anything to do with a woman. I will never have a normal human life. And the vow is, the boon was that he could not die until he chose, but he will never, and he's so dharmic, he's so powerful in his dharma, nothing will budge him. Well, Amba hangs out, and they send her back to Salva. Again, he sends her back with a flea in her ear. He won't have anything to do with her. So she hangs out at Hastinapura working on poor Bhishma, trying to do anything. And he's enamored of her, but he just won't go down that road. So she finally goes off, and she tries to find some kshatriya warrior, some king who will champion her cause. I mean, her life has been ruined by this. And so she tries to find some warrior who will champion. And they're all afraid of Bhishma. They're all unwilling, all of them are unwilling to take it on. So she goes off. And now she doesn't want to get married anymore. She just wants revenge. And so she goes off and she starts to do tapasya. And she is praying and praying and praying and praying and praying. And great austerity, going long periods of time with no food and meditation, doing any austerity she can to win the attention of Shiva. And eventually Shiva shows up and says, "What can I do for you, my child?" And she says, Bhishma ruined my life. And he says, "Well, okay." And she goes out. She gets a promise from him. And right now I can't think of the promise. She gets a promise from him. She goes back and she ends up finding Bhargava, Bhishma's guru, who's this great, great warrior. And she tells him the story, and he says, "Well, of course Bhishma should marry you." And he says, "I myself will go and I will champion your cause." And he goes to Bhishma and he says, "You've ruined this woman's life. And the vow is no longer legitimate anyway. The kids are dead. There's nobody left. You should take the kid, just get on with it." And Bhishma absolutely refuses. He is so locked into Dharma. He will not budge from it. The vow has been given. He will not budge. And so much so that Bhargava says, "You will either marry this woman or you will face me in mortal battle." And Bhishma feels really bad about this, but he says, "I can't break my vow. I will not break my vow." So he and Bhargava get into this battle. And the battle goes on and on and on and on, day after day after day. And Bhargava is impressed at how much his disciple has learned and how powerful he is. And finally, he reaches the point where he realizes that there is no victory to be had in this. And he just goes to Amba and he says, I also feel real bad about this. I tried. But there's just nothing I can do. I can't. He will not break his vow, and there's nothing more I can do. So now she goes back and she prays and prays and prays and prays. And again, the Lord shows up. He says, "What can I do for you?" She says, "I'm unsatisfied." And he says, "Okay, I'll tell you what. I will give you this unwilting garland. I'll give you an unwilting garland, and whoever wears this garland will be able to destroy Bhishma." So she takes the garland, she goes back around to every one of the kings. With this garland, she tells the story, and again, no one will champion her cause. And she ends up finally in the court of Drupada. And she tries and she works on Drupada and all the princes and all the kshatriyas in the area. No one will do it. And finally, in disgust, she takes the garland and she hangs it on a pillar in the courtyard of Drupada and storms away. And this has got so much malice in it and so much hatred and so much anger that no one will touch it. And it's unwilting, and so it just hangs there. And time passes. And then she goes back off to the woods, and again she does tapasya, and the Lord shows up again and says, "Now what?" And she says, "No one will take it." And he says, "Okay." He says, "In your next life, you yourself will be able to kill Bhishma." And she says, "That's not good enough. Because in my next life, I won't remember how much I hate him." And he says, "Okay, I grant you an extra boon. You will also remember how much you will remember this life in your next life, and you will be able to kill him and have whatever satisfaction you want out of that." And so she immediately turns and builds a funeral pyre and steps into the funeral pyre and is immolated so she can hasten her next birth, so she can get on with killing Bhishma. Okay, so that's her story. She's in there. So remember, that's Drupada's kingdom, household. And at one point, she is then, of course, born back into the household of Drupada. And she's one of the princes, Shikandi. She's born in the household, and she's just a little girl. And time passes, and at around 7 years old, she's just out playing in the courtyard, and she walks over to the pillar, and she takes the unwilting garland down, and everybody's just horrified, and she puts it around her neck. And everyone's going, you can't play with that. You don't know what you're doing. And Drupada comes out, and he says, oh my God, take that thing off. She says, I am Amba, and I have come back. And she walks off into the woods, and she starts to do tapasya, and she gets a yaksha who shows up. And a yaksha takes and works with her and transforms her into a man. And then she becomes Shikandin. And he becomes this great warrior, okay, with a single pointed purpose, which is to kill Bhishma. And he's a little weird. You know, Shikandin's a little bit off. So, you know, there's always a little bit of a spin around him. Okay, so now what we've got is about this time, we're back in Ekachakra. The Pandavas are there. And a messenger comes through. And the messenger is going around the entire kingdom because Drupada is deeply concerned that all of his desires have been destroyed. His desire to get revenge on Drona and to wed Arjuna to this beautiful young daughter that he has. And they both, by the way, Drishtadyumna and Drupadi stepped out of the fire fully mature. They were full adults when they were born of the fire. So he's got this beautiful daughter who's born for Arjuna, but Arjuna's dead. But every so often, so are all the Pandavas, so every so often this little rumor ripples through the kingdom that, you know, it's prophesied that Drupadi was born to marry Arjuna, so Arjuna must not be dead. And so it's time to marry her off. And the Swayamvara is, again, that ceremony where the princesses can choose, and it can be as simple as just choosing from amongst the Kshatriya warriors and kings and princes who show up, or it can be a contest. And so Drupada, with Drupadi's permission and Drishtadyumna's support, they plot to have a Swayamvara wherein an impossible feat of archery will be the victor. Whoever can accomplish this impossible feat of archery will marry Drupadi. And all the kings, so this messengers are going through all the kingdoms and spreading the word. And Drupada's secret hope is that if Arjuna's out there, that somehow he will hear of this and show up and win the girl. Okay, and so the big day is coming, and all the kings and all the princes are gathering in Drupada's court. And Krishna and the Yadavas, they show up. And now Krishna is related to everybody in this story. He's related to the Kauravas, he's related to the Pandavas. And he's got his own army, and they're the most powerful warriors in India. The Yadavas are unstoppable, and Krishna is their leader. But Krishna has specifically forbidden any of them from participating in the Swayamvara. They're not allowed. And of course, Karna shows up, and Dusasana shows up, and Duryodhana shows up, and Sakuni shows up, and all the Kauravas show up. And then, and Balarama is Krishna's older brother. And Balarama and Krishna are sitting there. And Krishna keeps saying, you know, he keeps dropping hints that he thinks that the Pandavas are going to show up, and Balarama just laughs at him. And Balarama is actually this really great character throughout the story because Balarama is the older brother, and so Krishna should look up to him. But of course, Krishna is the avatar. Krishna is the Lord incarnate. And Balarama is always kind of snubbing his brother and ignoring his brother and stuff, and playing the bigger brother. And he's in the story in part just to show that mere proximity to a liberated saint or a liberated master does not ensure enlightenment. Okay? That we have to also be receptive and tune in. And so he's always just slightly off base, and he's really he's a fun character. But anyway, they're talking together as brothers do, and Krishna says, you know, I swear to you that the Pandavas are going to show up. And Balarama mocks him and says they're dead. How can they show up? They're going to come from the grave. And then, of course, Kunti and the brothers, they gather themselves up. They're dressed as Brahmins. They have beards, matted hair. They look like a mess, but all their magnificence is under their appearance. And they arrive separately, and they spread themselves out throughout the crowd. And Krishna is sitting there, and he looks over at his brother, and he says, Balarama, see that really big Brahmin over there? I think that's Bhishma. And see that really, really fine-looking warrior-type Brahmin over there? I think that's Arjuna. And see that really noble one? I think that's Yudhishthira. And so pretty soon. So anyway, the competition is, there's a bow that is unstringable. It is a magnificent weapon, and virtually nobody has the power to even string the bow, much less shoot it. And the contest is, the archer has to string this unstringable bow, and then he has to, by gazing into the reflection of a pond, of a pool of water, he has to shoot a spinning bird target. And so archer after archer comes up, and Kshatriya after Kshatriya comes up. And many of them can't even string the bow. Some of them can't even pick up the bow. But then gradually one or two are able, and Dusasana is able to string the bow, but he can't do it. And Karna gets up there, and he strings the bow, and he just walks up, and just as he's about to shoot, somebody says, Sutaputra. And he lets go, and he misses the target, because everybody knows this is the one archer who could possibly, and Drupada is just panicked, because if somebody wins and it's not Arjuna, his life is over. He doesn't know what to do with himself. All of his dreams are wrapped up in this revenge and in getting this marriage happening. So anyway, somebody says Sutaputra, and of course, Karna shoots and he misses. He just misses. Duryodhana gets up there, and he strings the bow, and he starts to string it, and something happens, and he fails, and he's just humiliated. And he doesn't have the strength to get this bow strung finally. And so he comes back out of it humiliated, and Dusasana, and all Aswatthama, they all fall short. And now the crowd's getting a little bit restive. They're beginning to say, well, this is not a real Swayambara. This is a facade. He didn't really plan on giving this beautiful woman away in marriage. And they're beginning to get really, it's beginning to get ugly. And there's a little commotion over in the Brahmin section. And this Brahmin steps out and he says, excuse me, since all the Kshatriyas have tried and failed, is it okay if a Brahmin tries? And, a handful of the people go, yeah, great idea. Let's see if the Brahmins can do it. And the Brahmins are all cheering for their own and stuff. And so finally, it's approved that a Brahmin can try it, since the Kshatriyas clearly couldn't. And Arjuna just simply walks up, and he's magnificent. And he just strings the bow, and he looks into the pool, and he shoots the arrow and hits the target. And it's over, and Drishtadyumna, starts to bring the bride out. But all the Kshatriya warriors, they're incensed that this mere Brahmin would do what they couldn't do, and how dare they, and how dare this mere Brahmin enter into their thing. And then this other Brahmin steps out of the crowd, and he's big, and he just steps right up beside him, and he uproots a tree. He's standing there. And pretty soon there's 5 Brahmins standing out there around, ready to take them all on. And then, of course, wiser heads prevail, and they say, we said he could do it. He's accomplished what nobody else could do. And Drishtadyumna brings Drupadi out. And he says, meet your new bride. And so they gather themselves up. They gather Drupadi, and they head off, and they go back to where they're staying. And as they approach the home, just as they did in Ekachakra, they sing out, Mother, because Kunti had stayed back, Mother, look what we have gained. But they use the word bhiksha, which is what we have gained from begging, or what we have received today. And she sings out, as she does every day, what you have received, share equally among you. Oh, no. Yeah, darn. And then they go in, and there's this kind of, Kunti looks over, and she realizes that this is what they meant. And she's a little embarrassed. It's kind of, but then Drupadi falls at her feet and says, Mother, and there's this really warm embrace, and there's this really sweet moment of introduction and just real quiet. But then the mother's word is sacred, and they don't quite know what to do with what Kunti said, because she has never said anything that has been a lie. She's never said anything that has been falsified, and Yudhishthira says it's impossible for us to not honor what our mother has said. And here it is, she said it, she can't take it back, she said it. And then he says, and it's interesting, but I also, even though she was won by Arjuna, I also feel a desire to wed Drupadi. And all of the brothers recognize that same desire. Again, the symbolism of this, because this is a metaphor. Drupadi represents the Kundalini energy. And the brothers represent the 5 chakras in our system. And the Kundalini energy has to rise up through the 5 chakras equally before we're liberated, before we can come home. So that's the symbolism in this. But it makes a great story. So anyway, there they are. And about this time, they're trying to figure it out. Well, is this an adharma or is this a righteousness? It's righteous to do what the mother says, but who's ever heard of a woman having 5 husbands? And about this time, who should show up but Vedavyasa, who always seems to show up. He wrote the story, so I guess he can show up whenever he wants. But he shows up, and he's the wisdom in this, the deep esoteric wisdom. And he says, it's unusual and it's not practiced, but in higher ages and in higher times, it was not uncommon for women to have more than one husband. The scriptures say that unusual circumstances, and that this is a dharma. And so they recognize it. Meanwhile, Drupada is in despair because this Brahmin has won his beautiful daughter, and now, his life is over. And Drishtadyumna comes up and he says, "Father," and he's in this really morose state in his chambers. And Drishtadyumna comes up and says, "Father, I have an unusual sense that something good has just happened." And Drupada says, "I can't imagine what." And he says, "Father, I will be back." And he goes. And he actually had followed the brothers and Drupadi back to where they were staying. And he peered in, and he sees them in their magnificence. He sees them, and then he listens to them, and he sees Kunti, and he sees them bowing. And he hears just enough of the conversation. And he goes back and he says, I think that was Arjuna, and I think that she was won by Arjuna. And Drupada says, "Well, invite them all to the kingdom tomorrow, to the palace." And so the invitation comes and they all go. And sure enough, they go in their Kshatriya finery. And of course, Drupada's life has now been made by this. Except that then he finds out that his beautiful daughter, is not just marrying Arjuna, but all 5 of the brothers. And again, there's this little kerfluffle about, gosh, is this the right thing? But Vedavyasa speaks again. And it's finally agreed that as unusual as this is what will happen. Now Vidura's been there at this whole event, and Vidura leaves and he races back to Hastinapura because he's just going to rub Dhritarashtra's nose in this just a little bit. And he walks in and he says, "My lord, I offer you the warmest congratulations. Your house is now allied. It's double blessed. Your house is now allied to the house of Drupada." And Dhritarashtra thinks Duryodhana has won the beautiful girl. And he's just puffing up. And at that point, in comes Karna, and in comes Dusasana, and in comes Duryodhana. And they're scowling, and they're angry, and they're furious, and he realizes that what's happened is that Arjuna won the girl. Arjuna and the brothers are alive, and Arjuna and the brothers. So the brothers are all welcomed into the household of Drupada, and they're given wealth beyond measure. They're given half of the kingdom. They are ennobled, and there's great rejoicing. And the power of the Pandavas now is allied with the power of Drupada, and it's this enormous moment. And then there's a question, what should be done? What should they do with their lives? And at this point, Krishna shows up and he says, "You should go back. You should go back to Hastinapura. You should reclaim your own kingdom." And then they think about it and they decide that there is righteousness in this. So they gather themselves up, and Drupada says, "I will stand by you." And he gives them caparisoned elephants, he gives them armies and horses and warriors and peacocks and gold and ivory and this enormous parade, I don't know how else to call it, and power and pomp just gathers itself up from Kampilia, and off they go to Hastinapura, and they land. And of course, Dhritarashtra and Duryodhana and Sakuni and Karna and Dusasana and all the brothers, they're just seething. Because now, once again, spirituality's been driven out of the kingdom. We thought it was dead, we finally got rid of it, and here it is, once again, more powerful than ever, and now it's invincible. And it's clear. It's clear in everybody's mind that it's no longer possible for the Kauravas and the Pandavas to live together and share the kingdom. And so what seems righteous, and it's even suggested by Sakuni, what we should do is we should split the kingdom, we'll give them half. Well, the whole northern part of the kingdom is a wasteland. It's been cursed. But they split it and they make this great show of giving the sons of my brother half of the kingdom of Hastinapura. And the brothers and Yudhishthira just simply says, okay. And they send them off into this wasteland, this half. And it's just all been under a curse. It's just nothing but desert. But it's said, and Krishna comes with them, and many of the people of the town, of the city of Hastinapur, they gather themselves up to come, and they walk out the gates together with the Pandavas. But Yudhishthira stops, and he turns around, and he says, you must go back. There is no place for you to live. This is a desert wasteland that we've been given. But think of us and hold us in your hearts, and when the time is right, you may come and join us. And so off they go. But it's said that when Krishna and the righteousness of the house of Hastin returns to this area of the kingdom, the curse will be lifted. And the brothers enter with all of their righteousness, and as they enter into this desert, and they go to sleep that night, Krishna puts a spell on them, and they all fall asleep, and he calls on Indra. And Indra comes down, and in the course of their sleep, he revitalizes and reawakens the entire desert. So that when they awaken, instead of desert barrenness, there's flowing streams and beautiful pools and fruit-bearing trees and bushes and shrubs and grasslands and birds everywhere. And they awaken into this majesty and beauty. And they name the kingdom Indraprastha, after Indra. And time passes and everything is great. In the course of time, what happens is, and I don't think we have time for this story, but there's a celestial being that gets in trouble with one of the gods, with Agni, the god of fire. And Maya is the celestial being, and Maya is the divine architect. And he's about to get burned up in a fire, and Arjuna saves him. And so he pledges his eternal loyalty to Arjuna and Krishna and to the brothers. And he comes and he says, as an offering for my life, I will build you the most magnificent palace, and most magnificent sabha that has ever been created. And he does. And the rumors of the beauty and magnificence of Indraprastha and the hall of Maya go out throughout all of the kingdoms. And then time passes, and time is passing, and everything's fine, but Yudhishthira has a nagging discomfort because his father Pandu died in such an ignoble way, and he's afraid he may not have gone to the land of his forebears, that he might be trapped in kind of this astral purgatory or limbo. And in fact, a sage comes through and tells him that that's in fact the case, and that the way that he can redeem his father's soul, he can redeem his father and help him into the land of his forefathers, is to perform a ceremony called the Rajasuya. Now the Rajasuya is, every so often, it was a land of many kingdoms, India was, and they were all ruled by different kings, and they would war amongst each other and make different alliances and stuff. But every so often one would show up with enough power and enough wisdom and enough nobility to rule them all, and who would become the emperor of all the kings. And there would be a ceremony in order to have this happen, and that was the Rajasuya ceremony. There's a yajna, there's a ceremony, and there's many things that happen in this. And Yudhishthira is very reluctant to perform this. He's not interested in self-aggrandizement. He's not interested in this kind of worldly power. But for the sake of his father's soul, he finally goes along with it. And what they do is they take 4 horses, and they make them gods by the ceremony. And the armies of the king who wants to become the emperor or who's trying to perform the ceremony, the armies divide up in 4, and they follow the horses in the 4 directions. And the horses, wherever they wander, the armies follow, and they conquer. They have to fight whatever kingdoms the horses wander into, and then subdue the king, and then the king becomes subject to this emperor and has to pay homage and tribute and stuff. And so, of course, Yudhishthira stays home, and the 4 brothers lead the 4 armies and follow the 4 horses, and everywhere they go, they either are victorious or automatically the kings realize how great Yudhishthira's nobility is and his greatness is, and they just offer the kingdom to, and their subservience, their support into Yudhishthira. And time comes, there's actually one king, Jarasandha, who is the obstacle to this. And Arjuna, he's a great, there's a story about his birth that's very bizarre, but he's a great and powerful king. He was born, I'll see if I can do this abbreviated. He was born of a great king by a blessing of a sage who gave him a mango. The king had twin wives, and to keep them from fighting, he said, give this mango to your wives and they will bear you a son. So he cuts the mango in half, gives it to his 2 wives, they become pregnant, and they both give birth to half a child. And they're all a little distressed about this, so they toss the 2 halves of the child out in the woods. A Rakshashi finds them. She's going to devour this, whatever this is that's giving this human odor. She finds it. She becomes tender about this thing. He would have been such a great human being, such a big, huge kshatriya, that she ends up kind of trying to put him back together to see what he would have looked like. And as she does, this power comes in through him, and he actually joins, and he becomes alive in that moment. So this is Jarasandha. And he's a little bit peculiar, but he's a great and powerful king, but he's a little bizarre. He's very egoic, he's very power hungry. And he goes out, and he's been, all these years, he's been out conquering kings, and he's trying to get 100 kings, and he's going to offer them all to the god Shiva. He's going to kill them all. And part of the obstacle that they have to do is they have to get rid of Jarasandha, because he is the last obstacle. So Krishna, Bhima, and Arjuna, they sneak over the wall into Jarasandha's court, and they go and they present themselves as mendicants, but then he says, no mendicant comes over the wall like this, nobody with good intentions. And he says, and he's actually fought with, and he's been chasing Krishna for a long time. And Krishna just says, look, you have the 98 kings, you have to release them, it's a dharmic, what you're trying to do, and if not, then you have to fight one of us, you just pick one. And he says, well, I already know you're useless, he says to Krishna, and then he looks at Arjuna, he says, you're too much of a kid, and he looks at Bhima, and he goes, I'll take you on. And they go at it back and forth and back and forth. That's a great side story. But what happens is, Bhima can't kill him. And he keeps almost killing Bhima, and Bhima tries to kill him, but Jarasandha can't die. There's only one way Jarasandha can die, and that is he has to be rent in 2, like he was before he was born, or after he was born, but before he came to life. So finally, Krishna, in the middle of this, after day after day after day of fighting, Krishna takes a blade of grass when Bhima can see him, and he tears it in half. And Bhima sees this, and he goes, aha! And he takes and he tears Jarasandha in half, and he throws him down, and he goes, and he turns around, and he walks off, and he hears this noise, and he turns around, and Jarasandha is just back together and up again. So this is where some of the things I think from, what's that movie series where you have those... Terminator. Yeah, it's where Terminator came from. They keep coming back to life. Anyway, and he goes, oh my God, and the battle goes back. And then Krishna catches his eye again, and Krishna takes another blade of grass, and he tears it, and he tosses it in separate directions. And he gets the point. So he finally does it again. He tears him in half, and then he throws him in separate directions so that they're back to back. And that's the end of Jarasandha. So anyway, the Rajasuya is complete, and at the end of the Rajasuya, they're going to crown Yudhishthira as emperor. And all of the kings throughout all of the kingdoms have to come and pay tribute and honor. And they've all gathered, and some of them are pretty grumpy. Some of them are not real happy about this. And in the midst, even though they've been conquered, there's still some dark kings. And so they're kind of over there kind of muttering together. And then in the ceremony, it's custom that you take and you pick the most righteous individual you can think of, and you place them up on the dais and do worship. So the emperor worships somebody who's even greater than he is. And of course, who do they pick? They pick Krishna. But Krishna is a cowherd. Krishna is just raised as a cowherd. He's not even a king. He rules Dwarka and the Yadavas by acclaim, not by any formal position. And he's certainly not been born to it, because nobody knows his birth. And all these dark kings, they're incensed that of all the people who could have been raised into this noble position, the fool Yudhishthira and his boys have picked a cowherd over any of them. And so they start to get really, really upset. And Sushupala is one of the noisiest of the offenders. And there's this whole scene. But Sushupala starts insulting Krishna over and over and over. And Krishna just smiles and he just takes it and he just takes it and he takes it. And meanwhile, all this battle's getting ready to happen. And then Krishna says, 999. And Sushupala looks at him and makes one more insult. And Krishna just says, 1,000. And he takes his discus and sends it, and it cuts off Sushupala's head. Right here in the middle of the ceremony. And everybody goes, oh my God, what's just happened? And here it is, it's just tainted the ceremony. Turns out that he was a great soul. He was one of two of Krishna's greatest devotees, and he was under a curse. And he was born in this life to finish up this curse, and Krishna had promised his sister, and he had to die at Krishna's hand, but Krishna had promised Sushupala's sister that he would take whatever Sushupala gave and not raise a finger to him, even up to 1,000 curses or insults. So 999, 1,000. But here it is, it's poisoned this great ceremony, and so now everybody just got this really odd flavor. Yeah, I mean, even though they're Kshatriyas, this was a moment of celebration, not a moment of war. And here it is, and this death has happened. But they're going to go ahead and wrap it up, and it's time now to kind of look at the gifts that all the kings have brought. And Yudhishthira, Duryodhana, he's just smoldering, because here, once again, instead of getting rid of his arch enemies, there they are, and now Yudhishthira has just performed the very ceremony that he has always yearned to perform with all his heart. He's just beside himself. And then Yudhishthira, thinking that he's honoring him, and under normal conditions this would have been a great honor, it shows trust, respect. He goes to him and says, would you mind looking over and tallying all of the gifts that I've received? And this just is the ultimate. He just... Now not only has he witnessed all this, but now he has to go through every single gift and every single thing that didn't come to him that he would have wanted. So he's just smoldering. Now, this is happening inside of Maya Sabha, inside of the hall that Maya built. And it's the most beautiful. The floors are encrusted with gems and crushed semi-precious stones. There are pools, crystalline pools everywhere. It's just magnificent. But it has a special quality, that anyone who enters the hall with avarice or greed or jealousy in their hearts doesn't see things right. That the hall itself will play tricks on them. And of course, Duryodhana, there he is, with all of this jealousy and all of this anger and all of this fire burning inside of him. And he's walking through the hall and he sees a pool of water where there isn't one. And he sees a door where there isn't one. And he sees, a regular floor where there's a pool of water. And he just walks in and falls in the water. And of course, Draupadi's coming through the hall at that point. And she looks over and they'll know how the hall is made. And she sees him fall in the water and she just mocks him. She ridicules him. And now it's the final straw. And he leaves, and he just wants revenge. Anybody heard this before? He goes back to Hastinapura, absolutely humiliated, and he foregathers with Sukuni and Karna. And Karna always wants to do, back when they were found and landed in Draupadi's court, every time something happens, Karna wants to do one thing. What's he want to do? He's a noble warrior, and he wants to just go out and fight and win or lose. right? But Sukuni's always going, no, we'll find some devious way of handling this. And so, again, they foregather, and Karna just wants to go over there and conquer Indraprastha and destroy the Pandavas. But Sukuni says, no, I have a better idea. He says, one of the underlying principles that the Kshatriyas lived under was if you were challenged in any way, you had to respond. You had to say yes. And he said, Yudhishthira has a fatal weakness for dice, and he is a babe at the game of dice. So we should invite the Pandavas here, and we should have a dice game between you, Duryodhana, and Yudhishthira. And I will play on your behalf, and I am a past master of the game of dice. And so they decide that this is what they're going to do. They're going to have a dice game. And so they send Vidura. They say, Vidura, would you go and please invite our wonderful cousins who we so dearly love up down to our hall. It's not nearly as nice as Mayasabha, but it's what we have, and we'd just like to have them come and enjoy, and we'll just play some dice and have some fun and just game and sport together, just like the olden days, right? And Vidura tries and tries and tries not to have to go, but finally it's inevitable, and so he goes, and he walks into Mayasabha and he presents himself, and they're so overjoyed to see their uncle Vidura. But he's somber, and they say, Uncle, what's wrong? And he says, you have been invited to Hastinapura, ostensibly to play dice. And Yudhishthira says, I have no choice but to accept. And he says, and Vidura just says, I wouldn't go. But of course, Yudhishthira is the soul of nobility. He says, I've been challenged. It is by my cousin through my uncle, who is my father. Since my father died, we'll go. And so they go down to Hastinapur, they gather themselves up, and they go down there, and it's Draupadi and the Pandavas, and they arrive, and they're, so lavishly welcomed, and they're given the finest of foods, and they're given the finest of quarters, and they're just doted upon, and they know that no good can come of this. And so they go to bed, and they talk amongst themselves, what are we going to do? But morning comes, and they simply go into the gaming hall. And of course, Yudhishthira sits down, and Duryodhana starts to sit down, and then he says, my uncle, Sukuni, will play for me. And Yudhishthira says, but that's not how it's done, this is not dharmic. And he is taunted by Duryodhana. And he's taunted by Sukuni, and finally he just says, he bows to fate, and he says, okay, even though this is a dharma, I will go along. And so they wager a couple of the ornaments that they have on, and Sukuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira loses. And so they wager a few more of the ornaments that they brought in, and Sukuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira loses. And so the gaming goes on, and they run out of little ornaments and stuff, and the fever of the game is beginning to infect Yudhishthira. And he says, I wager this little village over here. And Sukuni says, fine, Duryodhana. And Duryodhana offers a village, and Sukuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira loses. And so he says, I wager the cattle in all of my villages. And Sukuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira loses. And he says, I wager all of the elephants and all of the sheep and all of the goats. And Sukuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira loses. And he says, I wager all of my villages. And Sukuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira loses. And he says, he's just becoming mad with the game now, and he wagers all of his towns and then all of his cities. Sukuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira loses. And finally, he's lost everything. He's lost everything. There's nothing left for him to wager. And Sukuni just simply looks at him and says, but you're holding back. He says, what do you mean? He says, well, you still have your brothers. And so he offers up Bhima. And Sakuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira loses. And he offers up Arjuna, and Sakuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice. And Yudhishthira loses. And then he just looks, and he says, but you haven't wagered. Actually, he wagered Nakula and Sahadev. And then he says, but they were easy to lose because they weren't from your real mother. They were from your foster mother, your stepmother. And so he wagers Bhima and he wagers Arjuna. And he loses. And then Sakuni looks at him and says, you still have yourself. And so he puts himself on the line, and Sakuni rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira rolls the dice, and Yudhishthira loses, and there is now nothing left. And then Sakuni says, but you still have one gem left. And they look at each other, and they have no idea. He says, you still have Draupadi. And Sakuni rolls the dice. And Yudhishthira rolls the dice. And Yudhishthira loses. And there's this moment of absolute silence. And Duryodhana is absolutely mad with joy. He finally has everything he's ever wanted. He has Indraprastha, he has Maya Hall, he has the entire kingdom, he has all of the jewels, all of the wealth. And he even has the brothers in his power, and now he's even won Draupadi. And he looks at his brother Dusasana and he says, Draupadi is no longer the wife of these fools. He says, go to the women's chambers and bring her here. And Dusasana goes to the women's chambers. And he finally chases her around, and he finally has to drag her by the hair. And this is such an adharma to a highborn woman. This is just never, ever, ever done. And he drags her into the hall. Oh, actually, yeah. And she gets into the hall, and she says, she stands there, and she looks, and there's Bhishma, grandfather Bhishma, and there's Vidura, and there's Dhritarashtra. And they're all there, and there's Drona, and they're all there, and they're not doing anything. And she looks at them, and she says, how could you possibly let this adharma happen? Has the house of Hastinapura fallen on darkness so deeply that you would let this kind of ignobility happen? How can you do this? And they just won't look at her. They won't meet her eyes. And she looks at them, and she says, I have one question for this hall. And they say, yes, what is it? He says, had Yudhishthira already wagered himself and lost himself before he wagered me? And they say, yes. And he says, then he had no right to wager me because he didn't even own himself at that point. So she's trying everything to make, and Duryodhana says, he lost you when he lost himself. You were already gone. He's trying to brush it aside. He says, in fact, these fools are my slaves. Even the clothes that they have on aren't theirs. And the brothers look at each other and they simply take off their clothing and they just lay it down on the side and they're just standing there. But they won't raise a finger. And then Duryodhana says, even her clothes don't belong to her. And he says, you are free of these fools. You are free to marry any man you wish. And he raises up the thigh of his tunic and he slaps his bare thigh. He says, you can choose any one of these great warriors. And Bhima looks at him in that moment and he says, I will not rest until I smash that thigh. So the first of the vows are being given. And then Duryodhana says to Dusasana, he says, even her clothes are not her own. Go, Dusasana, and take them from her. And Drupada looks at her husbands and they won't look at her and they won't raise a finger. Because Dharma has it that they've lost themselves. There's nothing they can do. And she looks around at Bhishma and Drona. And she looks at Dhritarashtra. And she looks at Vidura. And they won't meet her eyes. And she realizes that all human aid is lost to her. And she simply falls to her knees and starts to pray to Krishna. And she just loses herself in the prayer. And Dusasana walks over, and a sari is 6 yards of fabric. And he grabs a hold of one end of it, and he starts to pull, and he starts to unwrap the sari from around her. And he pulls, and he pulls, and he pulls, and he unwraps 1 yard, and 2 yards, and 3 yards, and 5 yards, and 6 yards, And still she's fully clothed in 8 yards and 12 yards and 15 yards. And no matter how hard he pulls, she's always fully clothed. And finally he works on it so hard that he's exhausted. And there she is, fully clothed. And there's this hush, there's this moment. And there's a realization of how horrific the adharma is that's been perpetrated in this room at this point. Dhritarashtra, he's so overcome with remorse, and he knows that this adharma is going to haunt the family. It's going to be the cause of the destruction of the family. And he says, and each of the Pandavas, they each talk about they're going to destroy one of the different Kauravas for this adharma. But Dhritarashtra finally stands up and he says, "Beloved princess, I'm so sorry. Forgive me and forgive us for this adharma. Let us make it right. Ask me anything, I will grant you a boon. I will grant you anything." And she says, "Free Yudhishthira." And he says, "Yudhishthira's free, ask another." And she says, "Free all of my husbands." And he says, "Done. Ask anything else." And she says, "Free Arjuna then, and then free all the brothers." And she says, "No. Desperate measures are allowed 3 times. I've gotten 3 boons. That's enough." And they start to gather themselves up and gather their clothes and put themselves back together and they start to walk out. And Dhritarashtra realizes that this is not enough. And he says, "I give it all back. Take it, give it all back, forget this ever happened. I beg of you." And they start to walk out and they're doing the curses as they walk out. They're so furious. And Duryodhana goes up to his father and says, You fool of a father. You fool of a father, do you realize what you've done? We had them in our power. We had everything we wanted. And now they hate us. And you've given them everything back. They can destroy us. And they will. And Dhritarashtra is caught between dharma and fear. And Sakuni says, "Invite them back for one more game." And they're on their way back to Indraprastha. They're halfway there. And they decide they're going to invite them back. And Sakuni says, "One more game." And he says, "Whoever wins will get all the kingdoms. And whoever loses will have to go into exile for 12 years. Then they send Vidura, and they tell him to go and invite them back. And Vidura doesn't want to do it, but finally he goes and he gets them halfway there, catches them, he stops them and says, "You've been invited back for one more game, and whoever wins gets the entire kingdom. Whoever loses will have to go into exile." And Yudhishthira simply stops, and he bows once again to fate. And they go back. And we will take a break. Back they come to the kingdom. Thank you, Yudhishthira. Back they come to the kingdom of Hastinapura. Nothing happened. Huh? Nothing's happened. No, we waited. And the terms are, Sakuni says, one more game, play, and win it all, or lose everything. And the deal is whoever loses, it's 12 years in exile, in the woods, everything lost. And then the 13th year, they have to be in hiding. And if they're found during the 13th year, they have to go back into another 12 years of exile. And the brothers are just, Bhima is just grinding his teeth. And all the brothers are trying to keep Yudhishthira from saying yes. But of course Yudhishthira sees the hand of fate. His father is behind this. Dhritarashtra, his figure who represents his father, and all honor is due the father. And so, besides, he can't help himself. And so he says, okay. And Sakuni rolls the dice. And Yudhishthira rolls the dice. And Yudhishthira loses. And they take off all their robes and they don barks and humble cloth. And they gather their weapons and they walk out of the kingdom. But Draupadi has let her hair down and is weeping. And Bhima is clenching and unclenching his fist. And Yudhisthira won't look at anybody. And Arjuna is casting rice in all directions. And Dhritarashtra says, what are they doing? What are the sons of my brother doing? And Sanjaya, introspection, his counselor says, Yudhisthira refuses to look at anybody because the fire in his eyes would instantly burn them up. He says, well, what's Bhima doing? Bhima is clenching and unclenching his fists. Well, why is he doing that? Because he's envisioning, he swears that he will single-handedly kill every one of Dhritarashtra's sons, after, and including destroying Duryodhana by smashing his thigh. And he also, somewhere in here, he vows, for handling Draupadi, he curses Dusasana, and he says, I will cut your heart from your chest and drink your blood. And Arjuna, what's Arjuna doing? Arjuna is scattering rice in all directions. He says, what's that? He says, that is representative of the arrows that will fly when the war finally comes. And Draupadi, what's she doing? She has unbound her hair and is weeping. Well, why is she doing that? Because the hair represents the mourning and the tears, the sorrow of all of the wives of all of your sons and all of the Kshatriyas who will die in the war because of this terrible act and a dharma. And out they go into the woods. And they leave the kingdom and leave it all behind. And they go off into the woods, and Krishna accompanies them. And he just says, he's very unperturbed, and he just says, he tries to actually get Yudhisthira to bend his sense of dharma, because he says, in the scriptures they say that 12 days are like 12 years. And we can let 12 days pass, and then we can just go back and attack. And Yudhisthira says, I will not bend from my dharma. And they're living in the forest, and there are some conversations, there are some things that happen in here that are worth noting. One of them is that Draupadi receives a boon. She, as a part of her exile, she receives a boon of a large pot, a large cooking pot. And the large cooking pot, every day, once a day, will fill up. And it will fill up with endless amounts of food. And the agreement is that the brothers will feed the Brahmins first, and they will feed anybody who's begging and anybody who's needy. Then they themselves will eat, and then Draupadi will eat, and as soon as she's eaten, the pot will produce no more food for the rest of that day. But this is how they will sustain themselves. And she's talking with Krishna, and she's humiliated, she's furious, she feels abused, and he just simply says, you are the wife, you're a Kshatriya wife, and your dharma is to hold yourself in the face of all adversity, unflinching and unwavering. And he says, this time will pass, and the war will come, and your sons, your husbands will be victorious. They will rule the kingdom. They were born to rule this kingdom, and you must simply bear up with the dignity of a queen and the power of your own nature. And she says, so she finally quiets down a little bit, but she is not the typical image of a Hindu wife. She is not something docile and just subservient. She is present, and she makes herself known. And so, at some point she's belaboring the point of how there she was being humiliated in front of the entire, court of the house of Hastinapura, and not one of her great husbands would raise a finger in her defense. And how dare they, and how adharmic it was for Yudhisthira to have gambled the kingdom away. And Yudhisthira just doesn't say anything, And Bhima is railing against him, and all the brothers are angry and stuff. And he doesn't say anything, and finally he says, when you tell me these things, there's nothing I can say, because I know that what you say is true. But there is nothing that will cause me to break my commitment to Dharma. And we will endure these 12 years. And so they all stop pestering him. They relax into the cycle of the time that they have. In another conversation, and I think I told this on Sunday, but in another conversation, Drupadi's talking with Krishna, and she always has the capacity to just have Krishna show up, and they're always having these conversations. And she says to him, "Tell me, Krishna, I don't understand. Tell me, Lord, how did I end up with 5 husbands?" And he says, "Well, you prayed for a good husband." And she says, "Yes, I prayed for a good husband." And he says, "Ah, but you prayed 5 times." Let that be a warning. There was an arrangement amongst the brothers that was made that Drupadi would spend a year with each of the brothers, and in this way avoid jealousies amongst the brothers over the relationship with her. And the deal was that if any of the brothers came upon Drupadi and her current husband in private quarters, they would be exiled for an extended period of time. And Arjuna is put in a position where he has to help somebody as a kshatriya, but his weapons are in Yudhishthira's court, inner chamber, and Yudhishthira is in there with Drupadi. And he has a choice between honoring his kshatriya dharma and being put into exile away from his family. And he chooses the dharma, and so he goes in and he says, "I'm sorry," and he grabs the stuff and he goes and he saves the Brahmin who needed his help, but then now he has to go into exile. And they try and talk him out of it. They try and say, well, it was a dharmic thing, and when a higher dharma, conflicts with the lower dharma ceases to be a dharma, you needed to do this, but he refuses to hear it, and he's beginning to get a little restless anyway. So he goes off on a journey. And in the course of this journey, this is a time when he's preparing for the battle that's to come. And one of the things that happens is he goes up to Mount Kailash, and he's seeking Shiva, because he's already gotten the Brahmastra, the weapon of Brahma, but now he wants Shiva's weapon, Shiva's personal astra. And so he goes up into the mountain, Shiva's abode, and he's there and he's meditating, he's doing great tapasya, and he's trying to draw the power of the presence of the god. And one day, he's out hunting because he needs to still also eat, and he's out hunting, and he sees across this glade, he sees a boar, and he draws his arrow back and he shoots the boar. But just after he shoots the boar, he sees another hunter across the glade who's also just shot his boar. And he goes out there, and he says, again, it's very adharmic for a hunter to shoot another hunter's game. And he gets out there and he goes up to the hunter and he says, "What in God's name do you think you're doing? How dare you shoot my boar?" And the hunter just looks at him and says, "I shot it first." And of course this upsets Arjuna. He's a little bit arrogant and a little bit haughty and a little bit full of himself. And he starts to argue back and forth, and he says, "That was mine." And the hunter just brushes him off, and Arjuna says, "Do you know who I am? I am the great Arjuna. I'm one of the Pandavas. I'm one of the greatest warriors on..." And the hunter just yawns and says, "I'm not that impressed, so what?" Says, "It's my boar," and he starts to go and clean it. And Arjuna challenges him. And pretty soon, Arjuna is beginning to do real battle, and the hunter is just brushing off his arrows and sending back things that he has to really struggle to protect himself from. And Arjuna's never run across anybody who's giving this kind of battle. And he finally, in desperation, he makes a shrine to Shiva. And he sits down to meditate, because he realizes that he's in the presence. He's got the greatness of soul to realize he's in the presence of somebody greater than he is. And he prays to Shiva and he says, "Lord Shiva, help me win." Right? "Help me win this battle. I'm calling on you." And again, the message in it is, when we find ourselves overwhelmed, turn to God, turn to Spirit, draw on the power of Spirit. Even if it's not even if it's a worldly goal, still turn to the source where all things come from. So anyway, there he is, and he makes a garland, and he places it around the Shiva Lingam, and he's there, and he's praying, and he opens his eyes, and he looks up, and there is the hunter, and the hunter has the garland around his neck. And he starts to get, and then all of a sudden he realizes that the hunter is none other than Shiva. And Shiva says, I've heard of your greatness. I'm impressed with your tapasya, and I came to see if what I had heard was true. He says, you are the greatest, you're the most noble warrior, you're the greatest archer and warrior, and I gladly give you my Pasupada. I gladly give you my weapon. And he gives him the weapon, and then they embrace, and off he goes. And in the course of time, Arjuna ends up, his father, Indra, in the heavenly realms, sends down a chariot to fetch him up to the heavenly realms. And there are a couple stories that happen from this time in Indra. And he goes up there, and he's embraced by his father, and he sits on the throne beside his father, and it says that it's like two Indras sitting there in the heavenly realms. There's so much glory radiating from father and son. And then it turns out that Indra wanted Arjuna to come up, A, because he'd heard so much about his son and he wanted to meet him, but also because he has a great enemy who cannot be killed by any of the gods. He can only be killed by a mortal. And so he calls on Arjuna because this enemy feels invincible because he knows none of the gods can get him, and he can't imagine that a puny mortal would ever have access. And so, of course, Arjuna goes and fights the battle and kills the bad guy and comes back, and everything's great. And the heavens are rid of demons again for some period of time. He comes back, and as he's in his father's court, this beautiful Apsara, this beautiful heavenly being comes to him and is smitten of him and works on trying to seduce him. But he is aware that Urvasi is his father's consort. And he feels a little funny about this, and he says, I mean, you're beautiful, but how could I possibly imagine being with you? You are my father's consort. And she says, things are different in the celestial realms. And she keeps working on him. But he's got and nobody has ever been able to resist the charms of Urvasi. And now Arjuna is able. And she gets so frustrated and so angry, God, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And she says, how dare you? You are no man. I curse you now that you will have to be a eunuch. This is a little to Arjuna's great undoing. This is not at all how he had planned on spending the rest of his incarnation. So he's a little put out, and he goes to his father, and his father hears of it. Actually, he goes to Chitrasena, who's a Gandharva up there. Chitrasena laughs, and he says, no one has ever been able to resist the charms of Urvasi. And he says, I will speak on your behalf. He goes to Urvasi. She feels a little bad about it. But the curse has been given, but she reduces it down to 1 year. And she says, this curse only has to be a year, and it will stand you in good stead when you're in exile. And so that all reconciles, and it comes out later on when time passes. Chitrasena and Arjuna, they become fast friends. They have a great time. Chitrasena is the Gandharva of dance and music, and he teaches Arjuna everything that he knows, and there's a great time had by all. In the course of time, Yudhishthira and the brothers are all getting restless, and so they go on a tirthayatra. They go out to all the different shrines throughout India, all the sacred places, and visit, and as a way of passing their time and lifting their consciousness. And Arjuna finally finds them at the final place, and there's this great rejoicing because the brothers are now reunited, and time has passed. There's a couple of other 3 stories that I would like to share from the 12 years. Okay? One of them is Duryodhana. He is never satisfied. And he's got all the kingdoms. He's got all the wealth. He's got all the elephants and all the horses and all the villages and all the everything. But it's not enough. Because he says, it's not enough that I have everything that belonged to my cousins if they don't see me from their reduced state enjoying this immense power and wealth. And so he decides to rub it in. And they know kind of generally where the Pandavas are in exile. And so they decide what they're going to do is they're going to do, it's right for a king to go out and do a census of the cattle and the king, in the different villages, and count the people and count the animals and find out what's really out there. He says, we'll just go and do a census, and while we're out there, we'll just go by the Pandavas and show them and just rub it all in. So off they go, and the Pandavas are camped near a lake. And the Pandavas, the Kauravas and all their retinue are coming. And it's getting late in the day, and Duryodhana says, let's set up camp over there by the lake where we're in great sight of the Pandavas, and we can rub it in and we can just enjoy ourselves, and we'll just spend a few days here. And he sends his brothers off. And they go up to the lake, but there's already a Gandharva and his wives are already camped there. And Dusasana says, the great Duryodhana wants this for his camp place, and you need to leave. And of course, Gandharva says, who is Duryodhana? Why should I bother? And he just dismisses them. And so Dusasana goes back, and Duryodhana is incensed, and they go and attack the Gandharva. The Gandharva simply, with all his power, he just simply captures Duryodhana, throws him into his chariot, and is riding off with him, much to the dismay of all the Kauravas. So they gather themselves up, and they go, we don't know what to do, so they go over to the Pandava camp. And they say, this Gandharva has stolen Duryodhana, he's bound him, he's captive, we need your help, would you please help us go get him back? So, of course, Bhima says, why should we do that? It's about time. And Yudhishthira says, we are Kshatriyas. It is a Kshatriya's dharma to help when there is need. Let's get past this pettiness. And so he sends Arjuna out. And Arjuna gathers himself up and he goes after this Gandharva. And as he's chasing the Gandharva sees who it is, and he just stops and turns around. And who is it? It's Chitrasena from the heavenly realms. And rather than doing battle, he's just glad, and he hands Duryodhana off. And he says, here, take him. And he says, your father sent me down here. He didn't want you humiliated. And besides, I wanted to see you again. So Arjuna takes Duryodhana and he rides him back, and he presents him to Yudhishthira and all of the Kaurava brothers. And Yudhishthira says, cut him free. And he looks at Duryodhana and he says, this envy, this constant yearning for something else, this adharma, will never make you happy. He says, I give you back your life, go your way. But Duryodhana has now been chastised. He's been saved by the Pandavas. He came to humiliate them. His life has been saved by the Pandavas, and then he's been chastised by who? Yudhishthira, of all things. And he's just absolutely humiliated. No matter what he does, it never works out. And he's finally, to hell with it, I'm done. He says, I quit. And he goes into despondency. And he just doesn't want anything to do with anything anymore. He's just going to go off and crawl in the corner and just die. And give it all up. And all of his brothers and Karna, they all come and they try and talk him out of it. And of course, we're not fighting the Pandavas because we think they're not noble. We know they're noble. We're not fighting them. We're fighting them because we don't like it. We want what they have. And they try everything, but it just drives him deeper into the despondency. And then Sakuni, he knows how to work with this. So he just goes up and he says, well, if that's how you feel, I think you should just give it all back right now. And that's enough to stir Duryodhana. Duryodhana kind of gets out of his lethargy and he thinks about it and he goes, no way. And he gathers himself back up and he heads back to Hastinapura. So the brothers are out hunting one day. And they see a beautiful deer. And they start to chase it. But the closer they get, the more they chase it, the more elusive it becomes. And they go farther and farther and farther and farther afield until they actually get lost and the deer disappears. Now, where there is dharma, where there's righteousness, there's victory. They have never had this kind of failing before. Everything they put their arms to and their minds to automatically comes true because where there's dharma, there's victory. So they're sitting there And they're thinking, what could we have done that was adharmic that would have caused us not to succeed in this? And while they're sitting there, Yudhishthira thinks, I'm really thirsty. And he sends Sahadev, he says, go climb that tree and see if you can see any water around. I'm just really thirsty. And so Sahadev climbs the tree, sees a lake, comes down and says, we'll get some water. And they all are waiting, and Sahadev goes off to the lake. And he gets there, and he's just thirsty beyond measure, and he falls to his knees, and he's just about to drink from the lake, and he hears a voice, a disembodied voice, and the voice says, "Stop. You must answer my questions before you drink from that lake, or you will die." And Sahadev, he thinks, who is this? I'm one of the great Pandavas. He says, what could possibly stop me? And besides, he's so thirsty, he can't contain himself, so he drinks from the lake, and he falls down dead. And the boys, the rest of the brothers are waiting. And Yudhishthira says, Nakula, where's your brother? Go find him. Bring some water, for God's sake. Hurry up. So Nakula goes off, and he finds the lake, and he sees his brother there dead. But he's so parched, and he's so thirsty that he goes to the lake, and he starts to drink. And he hears a voice that says, "Stop. If you drink before answering my question, you too will die." But again, the arrogance and the thirst and the lack of self-control. And so he drinks, and he too falls down dead. And then Arjuna comes, and the same thing repeats itself. And Bhima comes. What could possibly stop Bhima? And so he thinks, I'll drink, and then I'll answer the question, or go find this yaksha, or whatever it is, and I'll deal with it. And he drinks, and he too falls down dead. And Yudhishthira, he's wondering, he's lost all his brothers, where are they? And he's dying of thirst. And so he goes, and he finds the lake, and he approaches the lake, and he sees every one of his brothers there at the waterside, dead. But he's so driven mad with the thirst that he goes to drink. And the yaksha, this voice says, "Stop. Answer my questions first before you drink, or you too will die like your brothers." And Yudhishthira has so much self-possession that he stops. And he says, you must be a great yaksha, you must be a great demon to have been able to kill these are the greatest mortals on earth, and you've been able to kill them. What is your question, he says. And the yaksha asks a series of questions about dharma, about righteousness, and Yudhishthira answers each one of them thoughtfully and profoundly. And the yaksha says, I'm very impressed with you. He says, I have one last question. Answer it and drink. And Yudhishthira says, what is the question? And the yaksha says, what is the most astounding thing in the world? And Yudhishthira thinks for a moment, and he says, and this is immortal words, he says, that every day men see other men and all creatures go into the abode of death, and each one somehow thinks it will not happen to him. And the yaksha says, you are by far the most dharmic being on earth. He says, you may drink. And he says, and Yudhishthira drinks, and he says, and the yaksha says, I give you a boon. And you may ask anything of me. And Yudhishthira says, bring Nakula back to life. And the yaksha says, Nakula? Why Nakula? The greatest warrior and the closest one to you is Arjuna, and you need Bhima to win the war. Why would you choose Nakula? And he says, because Kunti has one living son in me, and Madri should have one living son. He says, you are truly the soul of Dharma. He says, I give you the lives of all your brothers back. And the brothers come back to life. And then the yaksha appears, and it is who? It is Yudhishthira's father, the god of Dharma and the god of death. And he says, I've heard of your greatness, and I wanted to meet you. And you are great beyond anything I heard. I bless you when the war comes. You will be victorious. And he gives the blessing, and off they go. Now, Duryodhana is not done yet. And he's trying to find some way to undo the Pandavas under any condition. And so what he does is he has one more trick up his sleeve. And he thinks, I know, there's a saint. His name is Durvasa, a rishi. His name is Durvasa. And Durvasa is known for his hot temper. And he says, and he knows about the magic pot that Draupadi cooks from, or they all eat from. He says, I know what I'll do. I will send Durvasa and his retinue to go and visit the Pandavas and have them arrive right after the pot is empty because it's a kshatriya's dharma to feed Brahmins. And they'll be there, they'll arrive hungry, they won't get fed, and he'll curse them. Okay? So Durvasa gathers up his retinue. He knows he's going to go visit the great Pandavas. They're very excited. They stop at a river on the way. They clean themselves up, they bathe, and they come. And they arrive. Actually, they arrive. And they say, we're hungry. Feed us. And Draupadi looks at Yudhishthira. And Yudhishthira says, it's your problem. You feed them. It's her job. It's her duty. And there's just, again, no human help available to her. There's this retinue. And she calls to Krishna. Now, at that point is when Durvasa says, we will go and we will bathe at the river and then we will come back and we would like to eat then. And she calls on Krishna and Krishna appears. And she says, help. And he says, let me see the pot. And he looks in the pot and there's one kernel of rice. And she's mortified because Krishna has now found her not being a very good housewife and not cleaning the pot thoroughly. But he takes the rice and he eats it. And he declares himself satisfied. And Durvasa and all of his retinue, they come back from the river. And he says, we asked you to feed us when we got back, but somehow we're all strangely full. And again, the message is when God is satisfied, everyone is satisfied. So time has passed, and it's time now to go into hiding. Every trick that Duryodhana has had to try and trap or ridicule or demean the Pandavas hasn't worked. It's now the end of the 12th year, and the brothers have to go into hiding, and they don't know what to do. I mean, how do you hide 5 brothers and their wife, these great noble souls? And they think about it, and they go, I know, there's a kingdom called Virata, and it's way off in the far, far corner of this area. And Virata is ruled by a noble king. And we will, it's Virata's kingdom of Matsya. And Virata is very noble. We'll go there and we'll disguise ourselves. And so they go over into that area, and the night before they go in, they're talking about what they're going to do. And Yudhishthira says, I will go in first, and I will tell the king that I was Yudhishthira's counselor. And that because Yudhishthira is in exile, I have nothing to do, and I would like to avail him, myself of, give him my services during this period of time. And they all think that's a great idea. And then Bhima says, I know. I'll go in, and I will tell them I'm a cook. And they all look at him and say, you don't look like a cook. I will also tell them I'm a wrestling teacher, but I will be the cook. And he says, and I know 1,000 tasty dishes. And they all agree that this is okay. And Arjuna, remember the curse of Arjuna from Urvasi? He has to live as a eunuch. So he says, I will go in and I will become the dancing teacher of the princess. And they all think this is a pretty good disguise. And then Nakula says, I will take care of the horses. And Sahadev says, I will take care of the cows. I'll be the cowherd. They all think this is a great idea. And then they look at their queen and they say, and what will you do? And she says, I will tell them, I will go in and I will beg a position in the queen's service. And I will tell her that I used to do Draupadi's hair. And they all think that this is okay. They're all mortified because this is the first time they've ever been apart. And even though they'll be living close to each other, there's no way that they can communicate with each other. But they all know that this is what has to happen. And so that next morning, they take all of their weapons, which are actually a part of them. I mean, this is an extension of their consciousness and everything they are. But they're identifiable. They are magnificent. And so they take and they wrap them in a cowhide. And they place them up very high in a tree. And they tell the village people from around there that it's the body of their mother. And that if anybody touches it, they'll be cursed. And then they place a mantra on it. And Yudhishthira the mantra is such that only Arjuna or Yudhishthira can come and get the weapons. That Bhima can't get them because they know that Bhima's a hothead and he's likely to come and try and get the weapons and blow it in the middle of the thing. So only Yudhishthira and only Arjuna can get the weapons. And then, of course, Yudhishthira goes in and he presents himself to the court, and he's so noble and so magnificent that the king is glad to have him in his council. And then Bhima goes in and he applies, and again, he said, you don't look like a cook. He says, well, I'll also teach the boys, teach the young men how to wrestle. He says, but I know 1,000 tasty dishes, and so they let him in. And then Arjuna comes in, dressed as the dancing teacher, and gets placed in the princess's service. And then, of course, Sahadev and Nakula come in, and then Draupadi walks in. And there's a stir in the kingdom because here is this beautiful, obviously high-born woman coming in, but she's unescorted, and this is unheard of. And she walks to the queen's chambers, and she goes there, and she has an audience with the queen, and she says, I would like to be in your service. I used to do Draupadi's hair, and I know 1,000 different ways that it can be done, and I would be honored to be in your service. And the queen, she's smart enough to know that this is not necessarily a good idea. She says, you're clearly a noble woman, and I would be glad to have you here with me. But she says, what if my husband, the king, should see you and fall in love with you? And Draupadi says, I will stay hidden in the women's chambers. He will never see me. And she says, okay, I will take you, and I will give you a private little garden and a private little area. And in this way, they're all ensconced, and so time passes. They say that where there is dharma, prosperity follows. And Matsya begins to flourish. And for no accountable outward reason, things just begin to do better there. In the meantime, Karna, remember Karna? Who is Karna? The first Pandava who's confused. Who is he the son of? Kunti and the god of the sun. And one night, and every day, Karna is so noble. He worships every day at noon the god of the sun, not knowing it's his father, but he always worships. And it's said that when he worships, anyone, during that worship time, anyone can come to him and receive any boon that they ask. Now, Surya has heard that Indra, Arjuna's father, is going to come and ask of him a boon. And Surya is concerned for his son, and so he appears to him in a dream, and he says, a mendicant will come to you, and he will ask of you your shield and your earrings. These are part of his power. These are part of who he is. And Surya says, it will be Indra, do not give them to him. And a short time later, Karna is indeed doing his noon worship, and the mendicant comes up. And Karna, without breaking his state, he says, I know who you are, and I know why you've come. And Indra simply says, give. And without even hesitating, he takes his knife and he cuts the shield off of his chest, and he cuts the earrings off of his ears, and he lays them down. And he says, I know that you've done this to favor your son. And Indra's so impressed with his greatness that he says, I give you my personal weapon. He says, and you can use it on anybody and it will be victorious. He says, but you can only use it once. And Karna says, that's okay, because I have only one enemy to use it on. Karna vows that he will eat no meat and drink no strong drink, nor say no until he kills Arjuna. Krishna now shows up, and he appears before Karna in his daily worship. And Karna says, what is it you want? And he says, I want you to know who you are. Do you know who you are? And Karna says, I was raised by Atirata and Radha, the Sudaputras, but I have no idea. And he tells Krishna of his dream. And Krishna looks at him and says, you are the son of the woman who has given birth, the women who have given birth to the greatest warriors on the planet. And of course, Karna knows who this is. And Krishna says to him, he says, you are the eldest Pandava. Forget this foolishness and claim your rightful place. Yudhishthira would bow at your feet. The entire kingdom would be yours. Everything, all honor, all friendship, all family life would be yours. And Karna says, you've only done this, you've only come out of your love for the Pandavas and your love for Arjuna. And you've told me this to cripple me so that when I'm fighting them in the war that's to come, I won't fight with all my strength. He says, I have sworn, he says, I cannot see Duryodhana the way others see him. Duryodhana made my life for me. He gave me everything. When my mother didn't want me, when my position barred me from everything, Duryodhana took me in. And I cannot be disloyal to him. And again, there's a great nobility. Even though it's a misplaced loyalty, Yogananda said loyalty is the first law of God. And so Karna, again, he's the great tragic figure because he's the firstborn. It's the desire for happiness committed to this world. It never gets it right. It's always allied to the wrong side. But then he says, when the war comes, I will fight Arjuna, and either Arjuna or myself will live, and there will still be 5 Pandava brothers. Time passes, and everybody's doing pretty well. The kingdom flourishes. And the queen's brother, Kichaka, comes back. He has been out conquering kingdoms for Matsya, for the king Bharata. He's been out again. He is one of the most powerful kshatriyas on the planet at this time. Kichaka is enormous and he's powerful. And he comes to see his sister. He is the brother of the queen. And he's in the women's chambers. He has the privilege of being related, and he's in there. And who should walk in at that point but Draupadi? And he looks at his sister and he says, who is that? And he's instantly enamored. And the queen says, you must not desire her. She has 5 Gandharva husbands who are in hiding. And she's already spoken for, she's just my serving woman. But Kichaka is smitten by her. And he wheedles and he works on his sister. And she finally sends Draupadi with an errand to Kichaka's chambers. And Kichaka tries to woo her. And she's absolutely furious. And she manages to escape. But she's furious. And she sends a secret message to who? Bhima. And Bhima's furious. And so he decides that he's going to help her out. And so they hatch a plot that she will send a message back to Kichaka making a plan to meet him in the dance hall at midnight. And she sends this message and she gets back a message, I thought you didn't want anything to do with me. What about your husband? She says, I was just shamming. I was just putting up a front so that they would not suspect. She said, I will meet you. And then, of course, what happens is just before midnight, Bhima sneaks out and dresses himself in women's clothing. And it's dark, and he lies down on the sofa. And Kichaka prepares himself to meet this glorious woman, and he's all ready. And he gets there, and he reaches out for her, and this massive hand reaches out and grabs him. And this tremendous battle ensues. And Bhima has got all of this stored up anger and frustration and fury, and he just destroys Kichaka. He pummels him, he breaks him, he stomps on him, he turns him into just a puddle. And then he goes back, and he cleans up, and he goes back. And in the morning, they find the queen's brother dead. And who could have done this? And Draupadi is sent for by the queen, and she's asked, and she says, I told you about my husbands, don't mess with me. She's just righteous and indignant. And the queen is horrified, and she tries to send her away. And Draupadi says, I will leave you soon, but not now. And she's so afraid that she allows Draupadi to stay. But now the word goes out throughout the kingdom. Who has the power to kill the great Kachaka? There's only 4 men in the entire kingdom, in all of India, who have this kind of power. One of them is Balarama, and they know where he is. One of them is Salya, and they know where he is. Kachaka, and he's there. And Bhima. So, meanwhile, in Hastinapura, what's going on is time is passing and is getting close to the end of the 13th year, and they cannot find the Pandavas. They look and they look and they look and they look, and nowhere can they find the Pandavas anywhere. And they're thinking, and they're trying to find them, because they know that the fastest way to solve this is if they can find the Pandavas before the 13th year is up, they have to go back into exile for 12 more years. By the way, for those that are interested, and does 12 years suggest anything to you? Astrological cycle of what? Of Jupiter, okay. So what we have, going back to the dice game, is there you are, confident in your spirituality. I can go and have a drink. I can go out dancing. I can go back into the world. I can go do these things because I'm secured myself. And we gamble away the kingdom. And what happens every 12 years, Jupiter comes back around and it says, will you choose the world or will you choose spirit? And whichever way we choose, and you'll watch, if you look, 12, 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, every 12 years you'll find that there's a moment or a period of time where you're invited to step into a relationship with spirit directly and more powerfully. And if you choose it, it will color the next 12 years. That will be what defines it. And if you don't, if you choose the world, that will be the predominant influence for the next 12 years. So they know that if they can find them, they can send them back into exile for another 12 years. So they're trying to figure this out. And then they start to hear, well, Matsya has been flourishing. And where there's righteousness, there's prosperity follows. So they start to, and then they hear the rumors about Kichaka being killed. And they start to put 2 and 2 together. And they decide that what they're going to do is they're going to try and flush the Pandavas out, because if the Pandavas have actually been there and they've been taking the hospitality of Virata and this kingdom for this time, that if Virata and Matsya is under attack, they will have to stand up by righteousness and dharma. They will have to stand up and help defend the kingdom. And so they create 2 armies. And they decide what they're going to do is they're going to attack from 2 fronts. And they gather themselves up and they start to come at Matsya. And Virata hears that this avenging army is on his doorstep, and he's very concerned, and he gathers himself up and he takes all of his warriors. And Yudhishthira says, I have fought for Yudhishthira, and I would like to come with you. And then Bhima says, I too would like to come, and Nakula and Sahadev, and they all join the army, and off they go. And they have a resounding defeat of the Kaurava army, but it's not the main army. And they spend the night out on the battlefield in victory and celebration. Meanwhile, the main army is coming in the other way. And it's Duryodhana, and it's Bhishma, and it's Drona. It's not Bhishma, it's Drona, and it's Karna, and it's Aswatthama, and it's Dusasana. And they're coming in because they figured that what they'll do is they'll flush them out, and now they can kind of conquer the kingdom, they can wrap it all up, they can get all the cattle and everything. And they're coming in, and the prince is the only one left in the kingdom. Everyone else went out to fight the battle. And he's a young man, and he's full of bravado, and he says, I'll go out there and I'll fight them myself. I'll take them all on, except I have no charioteer. And Draupadi whispers to the queen. She says, I hear that this eunuch is a pretty good charioteer. And the queen dismisses her and says, don't bother me. She says, I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know how we're going to fight this battle. Can somebody go get Virata? Can we get the rest of the warriors back? And Draupadi says, I understand that the dancing teacher is a really good charioteer. And she gets hushed up again. And finally she says, I don't think you understand. I think that that the dancing teacher is a really good charioteer. And so finally the queen says, well, we have no choice. Okay, go get the dancing teacher. And Arjuna simply comes in and says, I can drive the chariot. And he gets in, and he puts the prince in the back, and off they go. And then they go off to where? They go off to get the weapons. And they pull down these weapons and open the cowskin. And the prince says, where did these weapons come from? Who are you? And he says, you must tell nobody, but I am Arjuna, and these are the weapons of the Pandavas. And he selects his bow, and he selects the rest of his weapons and his conch, puts everything back up, puts it back up there, sets the spell again, and off they go. And he's driving the chariot, and then they come in view of the entire army of the Kauravas. And the young man, in terror, jumps from the chariot and starts to run away. And Arjuna simply reaches out and grabs him and places him back in the chariot. He says, you are a Kshatriya, you are of royal birth, you must stay and fight. And then he says, you drive the chariot and I will do the fighting. And at this moment, Arjuna sends 2 arrows and they flash past the ears of Bhishma. He was there. And then he sends 2 more arrows and they fall at the feet of Drona. And he's saluting his grandfather and he's saluting his guru. And then he goes out and single-handedly he fights all of the Kaurava army and he humiliates all of them. He humiliates Duryodhana. He smashes his chariot. He kills the horses. He kills the charioteer. And he has Duryodhana's life in his hands. And he lets him go. And as Duryodhana is riding away in humiliation once again, he sends 1 more arrow. And it knocks the crown from his head. And in utter humiliation, Arjuna has managed to hold off the entire army. But Duryodhana says, I see you, I recognize you, we've found you out. And of course, by this time, all of the rest of the armies have shown up. And Yudhishthira simply says, wiser heads than yours know that the 13th year has already passed. And that for tonight. Questions or thoughts? Okay, let's take a moment of silence together.